Alright, this is my attempt at doing my presentation in the physiology portion of our 881 class, NURS881 at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm going to do it as a YouTube video because of the technical difficulties that were experienced the other day with Adobe Connect and whatever problem we were having up in Prince Albert there. I don't want to have to repeat that level of frustration. So without further ado, we'll carry on here. So risk factors for cancer, environmental exposures is the topic of this presentation. And so in looking at that, I think a lot of us, when we think about environmental exposures and cancer, we would think of perhaps if there was a big industrial factory, with smoke spewing out of the chimneys, that cancer would come to mind with that, or definitely a higher risk for cancer with that. Certainly if you think of something like Chernobyl and in more recent memory here with Fukushima in Japan, so catastrophic failure of nuclear power plants, the risk for cancer goes up based on the environmental exposure there. But the truth of the matter is, at least in what I found in doing my research for this presentation, that it's a lot more insidious than that it's a lot more pervasive, and that we come into contact with things in the environment every day, particularly in manufactured goods. So this is sort of a post-industrial revolution change where, cancer has always existed, and was a result of exposure to certain things possibly, and then just anomalies within genes as one aged, but the incidence of cancer certainly has been more in the last century and a half, 2 centuries. So as we look at risk factors for cancer and environmental exposure, with cancer, the etiology of cancer is that it's not completely understood. Alright, so it's not entirely known what causes cancer. They can look at an individual that has cancer and see the changes, and the thought on it right now from the current evidence is that it's the carcinogenesis is a multi-stage process that is genetically regulated, so it actually affects the genes of an individual. The gene is basically reprogrammed, and then cancer is the end result. So in this, in the different stages there, first stage is initiation, so that's exposure of normal cells to carcinogenic substances. So this, and what we're particularly concerned with here is environmental exposures. So this results in genetic damage, which if not repaired results in irreversible mutations, cellular mutations. So this isn't only happening one time. You don't get exposed to a carcinogen in one event sort of deal and that changes you forever. It usually takes between 4 to 7 sort of exposures or hits. In our pathophysiology textbook there, it talks about hits is the term that they use to cause that mutation, or at least the process of it starting. So then move on to the second stage is promotion. Carcinogens or other factors alter the environment to favor growth of the mutated cell population over normal cells. So an example of this in the environment would be, say you have cells that have been changed in your respiratory tract from exposure to carcinogens, say in cigarette smoke for example, and then as you continue to smoke, those carcinogens then change the environment around so that those cells can grow better. It's like a repeated assault on the genes themselves, or the cells that are around there. Those cells are then that are normal are then, sort of made weaker, and the other genes or the other cells are made stronger. But the end result is that the mutated cells will grow more easily. They'll have less to deal with. So in the third stage there, conversion or transformation. So depending on the type of cancer, 5 to 20 years can lapse from the time of initiation, so it's from that initial exposure, to when a clinically detectable cancer will be found. So that's part of the problem with some of our environmental things, especially as we start to look at the manufactured goods and some of the chemicals that are contained in there, and chemically engineered substances. 5 to 20 years. So until there's a problem discovered, no one bothers to go back and check the safety perhaps of those particular substances that were used. It's only after the fact, as I mentioned earlier in the occupational setting, where they only look afterwards what was the commonalities there and what would possibly be something that caused the cancer, and then they go ahead and research that, maybe do some animal studies or whatever, and find out the problem. So 5 to 20 years. And in human terms, that's a fairly long time, up to a quarter of your life, and by that time it's irreversible damage. The mutation to the genes is already done. 5 years, of course, is a relatively short time, so that would be from something that's a little more carcinogenic, or the repeated assaults, or the hits would be, the frequency would have been more, perhaps in an occupational setting, and so it just develops sooner. Progression. Then the 4 stages. So this is the final stage of neoplastic growth. Further genetic changes leading to cell proliferation, tumor invasion to around the surrounding tissues wherever that starts growing at, and then of course metastases. So this is where then they've looked, right? Of course, when someone has cancer and they do histological exam, they find out that there's a genetic and molecular basis for cancer. And as we did discuss in class the other day about the oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes. So it's kind of neat the way that the pathophysiology textbook explains it, the oncogenes being accelerators. Right? So they start as proto-oncogenes, so that's normal. They're there every day for cellular regulation. And what can happen to them is exposure to a carcinogen. You can have a point mutation, chromosomal rearrangement, or gene amplification that activates the oncogene. So it can either produce excessive amounts of the normal gene or a product, so what it would be normally doing, so it's just too much of a good thing, or there can be an abnormal gene product then being produced by these oncogenes. So it results in dysregulation of normal cell growth and proliferation. So then you have the other types, which are the tumor suppressor genes, which are essentially the brakes, in contrast to the oncogenes being the accelerator. So they regulate and inhibit inappropriate cellular growth and proliferation. Gene loss or mutation results in loss of control over normal cellular growth. So as a result of being exposed to carcinogens, they're no longer able to control cellular growth or inhibit inappropriate cellular growth. So there's the proliferation that happens. So instead of normally acting as a brake, so the oncogenes, the accelerator, there things are going faster than they should be, and with the tumor suppressor gene, the brakes aren't functioning anymore. So a single, just want to point out or stress the point that a single mutation is insufficient to initiate cancer. Its combinations of mutations are required, and each mutation is inherited by the next generation. So you get exposed, you get these 4 to 7 specific hits at the initiation period, and the mutations that occur in the genes are then passed from one generation to the next. So then obviously the more cells you have that have that mutation in it, the greater the problem is going to be for the individual. So our pathophysiology text asserts that cancer is predominantly a disease of aging. Essentially, the longer one, or what they're saying is that the longer one lives, the higher the incidence of cancer. But I mean, that's based on what we see in the world around us today. It would be interesting to know if that would be the same conclusion that would be drawn if we were to look at people 200 to 300 years ago. So certainly there's some environmental and occupational links. Table 12.1 of the McCann's pathophysiology textbook talks about that. It appears that the majority of cancers are caused by carcinogenic exposure rather than rare genetic conditions. Okay, so there's something causing it. The fact that someone might have a rare family trait, in their gene pool is not normally the cause for cancer, although as we do know that can be an actual cause of cancer. There's, the data there to support that, but the vast majority of the time it's to do with something outside of us, a carcinogen that one's exposed to. So the majority of the information that I looked at came from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services National Toxicology Program, their report on carcinogens. It was the 12th edition that was published in 2010, and I'll have a link for that when I post my stuff on Blackboard there. I'll have a link for the report that you can go to. It's over 500 pages long, and so listed on there are things that they know are actually human carcinogens. So under the category of known to be human carcinogens, there's 54 different items there.